30 ballistic missiles crossed Jordanian airspace toward Israeli territory in a window of less than 12 minutes. And when the last of them struck the ground or was intercepted, the ceasefire that had cost weeks of mediation by Oman and Switzerland ceased to exist, not as metaphor, as accomplished fact. The precise number matters more than it might initially appear. 30 ballistic warheads represent, according to estimates by analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, approximately 15% of the medium-range missile arsenal that Iran maintains operational and ready for launch at any given moment. A stockpile that Tehran spent more than 2 decades and approximately $20 billion building, developing, and dispersing across hardened silos and mobile platforms throughout the Iranian plateau. 15% of the arsenal is not a symbolic strike. It is a strategic declaration that consumes real resources that are extraordinarily difficult to replenish under the weight of sanctions that strangle Iranian access to precision components and specialized metal alloys. But the central paradox of this crisis did not lie in the missiles that were fired. It lay in what the firing revealed about the Iranian regime's actual position and about the invisible cost that Tehran had decided to accept by destroying with 30 projectiles the only diplomatic instrument that still offered it any protection against an Israeli retaliation of far greater scale. The ceasefire, imperfect and fragile as it was, functioned as a political shield for Iran. As long as it held, any large-scale Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear infrastructure would have been diplomatically costly. Washington would have hesitated to endorse it, Europeans would have condemned it, and even Gulf allies like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia would have had room to distance themselves. The moment Tehran fired those missiles, that shield evaporated. Israel gained in a single early morning what months of diplomatic pressure had failed to deliver: operational and moral carte blanche for a disproportionate response. The weapon the regime had launched to wound its enemy was, in that moment, destroying its own source of protection. And here was the second layer of the paradox, the one that was not yet being discussed with the frequency it deserved. Every Iranian ballistic missile of the Imad or Khaybar-Shikan type that crossed that airspace carried not only a warhead, it carried data, trajectory data, radar signature data, thermal profile data during atmospheric re-entry, and that data was captured, catalogued, and processed in real time by Israeli, American, and, according to reports from the Financial Times, also by NATO monitoring stations positioned in the Eastern Mediterranean. With every launch, Iran was handing its adversary the technical manual needed to make its own missiles less effective in the future. The paradox had closed on itself. Step back for a moment and consider the complete picture. The ceasefire that had just collapsed was not a peace agreement. It was a mechanism for temporary containment, negotiated following the escalation earlier that same year, when Israel had struck research facilities associated with the Iranian nuclear program on the outskirts of Isfahan in a wave of airstrikes that used, according to the newspaper Haaretz, at least 24 F-35I Adir fighters operating along routes that cross Saudi airspace, a passage that Riyadh never officially confirmed, but which Pentagon sources described to the Wall Street Journal as de facto tactical coordination. The cost of that Israeli operation was estimated at approximately $380 million in precision-guided munitions and aviation fuel, a figure representing roughly 1% of Israel's annual defense budget spent in a single night. The ceasefire was what prevented the repetition of that scenario at an even greater scale. Now, there was nothing left to prevent it. But the true impact of this operation extended far beyond the numbers on the battlefield. The instant air raid sirens sounded in Tel Aviv and Haifa, the price of Brent crude on London's futures market jumped $11 in less than 4 hours of trading. a move that pushed the barrel past the $107 mark, the highest level since the European energy crisis of 2022. The Strait of Hormuz risk premium, the additional cost that insurers charge oil tankers for crossing that 48-kilometer-wide corridor through which approximately 21% of all petroleum consumed daily on the planet passes, surged to the equivalent of 2.8% of cargo value, according to data from Lloyd's of London. For a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels at $107 each, that meant an additional cost of nearly $6 million per transit. This is not merely a question of territory on a map. It is a question of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning, with the frequency the data deserved. Beijing. China imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day, of which roughly 40% cross the Strait of Hormuz, and a growing portion comes directly from Iran through a network of tankers with transponders switched off, the so-called ghost fleet, which the consultancy KPLA estimated at more than 600 vessels operating outside Western compliance radars. Every $10 increase in oil prices costs the Chinese economy approximately $40 billion annually in additional imports, at a moment when Chinese GDP growth was already decelerating to the 4% range, the slowest pace in 3 decades, excluding the shock of the pandemic. Beijing needed cheap Iranian oil, needed the Strait of Hormuz open, and needed a ceasefire that kept the region stable enough for its ships to keep operating without military escort. Iran had just destroyed all 3 simultaneously. The board had been upended. In the shadow of this monumental strategic miscalculation, there was one individual whose name deserved to be placed on the record. Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force. The man who directly controls Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, and who, according to profiles published by Reuters and BBC Persian, was described by officers who served under his command as someone who calculated strategic decisions like chess moves, but who over the preceding 18 months had demonstrated a growing appetite for direct risk that alarmed even members of Iran's own Supreme National Security Council. Hajizadeh is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the command coordinate of what the regime chose to consume: diplomatic credibility, deterrence capital, and missile reserves that take years to replenish. And so we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, though that was the comparison dominating the editorial pages. It is the 1973 Yom Kippur War, but seen from the Egyptian side after the crossing of the Suez Canal. President Anwar Sadat launched that attack with limited objectives. He did not intend to destroy Israel. He intended to alter the political dynamic that blocked any negotiation. The initial tactical success was real, but the strategic consequence escaped Sadat's control entirely when Israel reorganized, crossed the canal in the opposite direction, and encircled the Egyptian Third Army. The lesson of 1973 was precisely this: a limited strike against an adversary with technological superiority and strategic depth does not freeze the dynamic in your favor. It accelerates the response you were trying to prevent. And here was what that layer revealed about the present. Iran had repeated Sadat's logic without possessing the Soviet shield that prevented Egypt's complete destruction in that October, 53 years prior. But there was one layer we had not yet touched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely: the cost of replenishment. Each EMAD missile cost the Iranian program between $8 and $12 million in components, assembly, and testing, according to estimates from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. 30 missiles represented an expenditure of approximately $270 to $360 million. a sum Iran would need to finance with an economy that, under the weight of reimposed sanctions, had seen its official oil exports fall to roughly 1.4 million barrels per day, less than half of what it exported before 2018. The complete replenishment of those 30 missiles, maintaining the current production cadence of Iranian factories, would take between 14 and 20 months. And here was the data point that conventional reporting was not displaying with the frequency it deserved. During those 14 to 20 months, Iran's deterrence arsenal would be objectively weaker at precisely the moment when the probability of a large-scale Israeli retaliation had just been maximized by the destruction of the ceasefire. Every additional day was one more day of self-inflicted strategic vulnerability. Consider carefully what this number represents in practice. Iran had traded 30 missiles, 15% of its operational medium-range arsenal, for zero territorial gain, zero confirmed structural damage to Israeli military capacity, zero diplomatic progress, and the complete destruction of the only political mechanism restraining the adversary's response. The cost-benefit calculus of this operation was, by any metric of strategic analysis, catastrophic. Russia was watching these developments with direct interest. Moscow depends on Iran as a supplier of Shahed drones for the war in Ukraine and as a partner in pressuring global energy markets. An Iran weakened militarily, exposed to massive Israeli retaliation, and with its industrial missile production compromised for nearly 2 years of replenishment, was an Iran with diminished capacity to supply what the Kremlin needed to sustain its own war of attrition on the Ukrainian front. The impact of this night of missiles extended from Tel Aviv to Kharkiv, and this connection between the two poles of conflict reshaping the global order in the 21st century was precisely what most conventional analysis was failing to articulate. What remained after those 30 ballistic trajectories was a Middle East without the only containment mechanism that still functioned, an Iran more strategically exposed than at any point since the Iran-Iraq War, an Israel with operational legitimacy to escalate at a scale its own generals had been requesting for months, and a China quietly calculating how long it would take before the energy cost of this crisis began to erode its own internal economic stability. The question defining the next chapter of this crisis is not whether Israel will retaliate, it is at what scale, against which targets within the Iranian nuclear program, and whether Washington will attempt to constrain the response, or for the first time since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, simply step aside. If this subject changes the way you see the balance of power in the Middle East, share this video with those following the crisis and leave in the comments which Israeli retaliation scenario you consider most likely, because the next move is already being planned, and Tehran's clock was running.